to the Production Talk podcast with me, Yarn of mixartist.com.au. In this podcast series, we celebrate the modern way of producing music. We want to talk about all things related to songwriting, recording at home, and music production. So if you produce your music at home, this is the place to be. Please subscribe and recommend this podcast to all your friends. This is the Production Talk podcast, episode 36. Well, thank you for tuning in to a different sounding episode of my podcast today. So just before I start the conversation today with Kamal, I'd like to just briefly acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land that this conversation is taking place on, the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So today we are at the ArtOfAudio studio with my friend Kamal Engels, and we're recording in binaural techniques. So you should hear me on my right ear, and on your left ear is...
Kamal is here on the other side.
How good is this?
It was just a spontaneous idea because Harry, that's the dummy head, he was standing around and I thought let's plug him in, why not?
Why not? So we're coming in binaural sound to you today. So this episode is probably best listened to in with headphones, I guess.
Yes.
Good. Well, Kamal, thank you for having me and for making time. That's really amazing.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Just introduce yourself quickly and tell us about yourself and your musical career, maybe some highlights.
Oh dear.
Be shameless.
Well, what can I say? Kamal is my name. Kamal Engels. I'm originally from Germany, came to Australia about almost 30 years ago now. And I had a bit of a career in Germany already, being a musician. Actually, that was my core thing there. I was a musician because I came into music when MIDI was invented.
Yeah.
And which gives you a hint how old I am.
You're talking early 80s here.
Yes, we do. But that basically for me was the first time that I could realize musical ideas without having to hire a studio and a bunch of musicians. And one thing led to another. I actually did study what's called in Germany Tonmeister, which means sound master, directly translated, and it's basically studying electronics and audio engineering and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And I was very lucky, and in the 80s I was quite successful with my music, which was basically instrumental music. And I think it fell under the umbrella of New Age music. And that was a very new area at that time of music, and it developed, fortunately for me, quite quickly into something, very successful. And from there I started exploring other styles and so on and so forth. Then I came to Australia. I kept doing my albums for first a German label, then an American label. And then came a time where I kind of was over it.
You got sick of it?
I got sick of minor pentatonics and lush pads. It was an interesting place to be when suddenly you realize I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah,
it happens. It does happen, yeah. And it was also great because it led me into following a career of being more of a sound engineer and more of a producer. How did it go on? Let's think. Okay, so I came to Australia. I set up a little home studio for myself in my house and produced for these labels. And then I started expanding my equipment to be able to record more, so moving away from MIDI synthesized, loop-based music to actually recording what I wanted to hear, rather than reaching into the can and pulling out a loop or whatever, or a synth sound. And that has become more and more my passion, that I really enjoy recording live music with microphones. Rather than like the standard things that you can, I mean, the palette of what's available these days in terms of VST instruments, samples, loops, whatnot, is just stunning.
Phenomenal, yes. And I can see you still have a keyboard right in the center of your control room.
Oh yeah. So it's not that I completely. I don't have anything against it, or a philosophy.
Of course not.
A friend of mine, also an amazing sound engineer and producer, he says, like, in his studio everything has to move air, otherwise it's not used. So no loops and no canned music. Yeah, and so over time I built up my career here as a producer, definitely not only for new age music, but reaching into world music, into folk, into a bit of rock, pop, and what I particularly like is mixing genres, like bringing jazzy elements into rock, or folky elements into something more new agey, let's say. Just to broaden the scope and make albums, if there's a whole album to produce, interesting and eclectic, not that everything sounds the same.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, excellent.
That's the ideal.
Fantastic.
Yes, and that's what I'm still doing, and I wouldn't know anything better that I would want to do. It's my passion. I love it. I love good sound, whatever good sound means, because that is an interesting question in itself.
Oh yeah, open discussion to be had. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've got your beautiful studio here up in the hills in the east coast of Australia. Your setup is phenomenal. It sounds ridiculously beautiful in here. So you're literally set up to do live bands, smaller live bands here?
Yeah. I mean, the studio where we're just sitting here, I mean, I had live bands in here, but simply, generally speaking, to set up a whole band and let them play, the space is too confined. For that you need larger rooms. The sound has to breathe, which is also something that I didn't know, and I actually realized it when I once had a singer from Tibet here. And the Tibetan singing style comes from a tradition where literally the people had to yell from one valley to another valley.
Okay.
So literally over kilometers. That's where this high yelling type of vocalizations come from.
Yeah, right.
And they have incredible voices. They are loud and intense and piercing and at the same time haunting and beautiful. But I realized, having that person in the studio here, it was too much. Everything that bounced off the walls, although there's acoustic treatment in here, was just too much for it felt contained and constrained, the sound. And I think I would have liked to record her outside.
With a microphone on the other side of the valley?
Probably not quite, but it needed space around it. That's it.
Right. Oh, how did you solve that? How did you fix it?
I didn't really fix it at that time. It was something that I came to this idea of going outside later, and by then the person had to leave, go back to Tibet. So no, I didn't solve it.
Okay.
The recording didn't turn out how I wanted it to. I didn't feel like I did this particular style of singing justice. It wasn't great. So that's not a highlight, though.
yeah, exactly. We're actually meant to speak about the highlights. But, isn't it that, sometimes our mistakes that we make, are actually the points where we learn most?
Absolutely.
Isn't that the case as well?
That's
so that might still be a highlight from that angle.
Yeah, and that end it was just a learning, you know, like it still is. Every recording is, in a way, a certain challenge, or at some stage I come across something where I go like, maybe I try this differently, or I have to find a particular solution to a particular problem, you know, that wasn't standard. So back to the highlights, though. What are my highlights? Well, I guess the big highlight, although at the same time a very interesting occurrence in itself, was that I produced an album with the Guitar Monks of Tibet here, and it ended up being nominated for a Grammy. It didn't win the Grammy, but that was a lot of fuss, let's say.
Wow.
And
that's big.
Yeah, that's also what I realized, that wow, this is pretty big, you know, to have that opportunity to be nominated. The album was nominated, but I was the producer, you know, to be the producer of a Grammy nominated album.
That's huge. Nice. That's huge, and I can see there's a shelf with quite a few awards on there as well. So,
yeah, that's more local awards from Australia, from Musicos, and from the Dolphin Awards here, and I also have quite a few from America there, from the industry there. Yeah, but
wow, that's quite a story already.
Yeah, I don't know what to say more. It's,
okay, no, that's fine. Of course, I have a range of questions that I want to throw at you.
Yeah,
maybe we can just move into that direction if that's okay. Look, is it you're a bass player?
I am, yes.
And you're also a singer?
I do sing. I wouldn't call myself a singer, but I do sing.
Oh, all right, come on. You know, I've listened to the songs you produce, and you know, your singing is still much better than quite a few others I've listened to before. So you know, that's definitely really, really good work. But if it's okay, maybe let's just talk about bass for a moment, because I think, you know, the bass is one of my favorite instruments of all. I love mixing bass. I don't know how to play a bass at all, so I have very few insights on this end. But what would a bass player need to know in order to produce a good sound in a studio? What common mistakes have you come across that need to be prepared for, or you know, what would a bass player have to do so that the tone comes out really nice in the studio?
I think one of the main qualities of a bass player in the studio, so let's say studio musician, is, besides, you know, being versatile to a point in genre, you know, what kind of music, to be to have an evenness in tone. You know, that what I come across quite often, also in my own playing, when I go back, when I record, and I see like, oh, you know, some notes tend to be very quiet, some notes jump out. So one of the qualities that's I find important, although it will be helped with compression and you know, maybe clip gaining and so on and so forth, but as a general trait for a bass player is to, when you play bass lines, is to have an even tone, that each note matches the energy and the vibe required. That doesn't mean that you cannot play soft and hard. On the contrary, you know, that makes the scope and the colorfulness of the performance. But so things that I come often across is that I get a bass track where where, for instance, the instrument has dead notes. You know, where, let's say, I don't know, the A string for some reason has not the same the same quality as the other strings, so they fall flat or they stick out. Which mostly has to do with, you know, a bass that is not properly adjusted.
So it's the action that we talk about, the distance between the neck and the string.
Yes, the action, the relationship to the pickup, and that's the simple thing. But then also, to a great extent, if the playing itself is uneven,
Yeah.
If there's not the discipline or the skill to be able to produce, like, if you play, for instance, like eight notes, just on one string, bop, 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 you want to practice or get to be able to produce that as a very even signal.
Yes.
Or have control that you can go
for accents, yes.
For accents and so on and so forth. So that is kind of the main thing. In terms of sound itself, that's a tricky question, because there's a million sounds. There's so many different sounding bases per se, from their design, from their pickups, from their electronics. Then the next element is, of course, the bass amp. If not a bass amp, there's a DI box at least. That's the absolute minimum for an electric bass player.
That opens a can of worms. I would like to dig a little bit deeper. Can you produce a good bass sound just from a DI signal, or is there a certain limit that you can't get past unless you have a proper amp?
Well, let me say, contrary to what probably most people would say, I think I can. At least that it is to my satisfaction, generally speaking. Generally, I would record an electric bass through my bass amp, which gives me monitoring, because as a bass player, I don't only hear a bass, I feel it. I want to have a little kick in the butt when I pluck the string.
Or a big one.
Or a big one, exactly. And the other thing is going through, it's a tube amp, so there's a bit of a coloration through the tube stage that I find pleasant. Then usually in the recording stage, either already in the recording chain or later on, I put it through a nice vintage preamp like V76 or something like that, and push it a bit so I get a bit of grunge into it, a little bit of harmonic distortion, and that usually gives me a really good bass sound.
Okay.
Having said that, depending on the track where it's used, I find myself from time to time actually putting the bass into a reverb to give it kind of like spatial.
I see.
Spatial placing.
Would you do that in recording or later in mixing?
Later on, definitely later on.
Yeah. Okay. So you wouldn't track through a reverb and record.
No.
The reverb baked into the bass.
Definitely not, because that depends solely on where things end up in the mix.
Yeah. That's a good
that
point.
I have to find the place. Just a little bit of a bounce off the walls in an artificial studio environment. So, of course, I wouldn't take like a huge plate reverb or like large reverbs. It's rather more ambient. I actually do use mostly for things like that the Ocean Way Studios from UAD, because it emulates so beautifully a real environment, like a real studio. And I can go as close or as far away as I want. And it's quite common for bass also to sometimes engineers have the bass player in the corridor, for instance, or have the bass player in the studio but leave the door to the corridor open and put a mic somewhere in the corridor, and they get a certain coloration or a certain spatial like a little delay reverby thing going that gives a different context to a really otherwise quite a clear mono signal, so to speak. I mean, there is even the practice to mono frequencies below 60 hertz, that there's no stereo happening below 60 hertz, that can be part of mixing, can be part of mastering, to tighten up the low end. You don't want things waft around on the left and the right in bass, simply because often the wavelength itself is something that has different nodes, between the left and right channel, so to speak. So you want usually pretty tight, but depending on the bass sound, it's nice sometimes to add a little bit of air around the
Space.
instrument. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. That's lovely. When it comes down to bass amps, you just mentioned now you like tube amps
Mm-hmm.
because they obviously change the sound. They add a certain gloss to it. Is that right to say? To the tone of the bass, certain smoothness.
I wouldn't call it gloss. There's there's a bit of the harmonic overtones. It's basically distortion. To put it right. Very slight,
but very subtle.
A bit of a bit of bite into it, and again, it depends. There's so many bass sounds around. Some have almost no high end in it. And some have. I'm just reminded of Grover Washington. Like this album. God, from when was that? There was also in the 80s somewhere. I hear the crystal raindrops fall and the beauty of it all. And the bass in there, fretless bass, I think is it Abe Laboriel? I think so. Has this bass, fretless bass, that, is like singing in the top end. It's like buzzing and singing, but in a very smooth and clear way. It's almost like a guitar, but plus the low end. So there's quite a dip in the mid range, but a lot of top end. Slapping again, you thumb it or you slap it, you get a lot of top end.
Yeah.
So, there's so many ways to record that. Electric bass, that is.
Yes, of course.
Which brings me again, because I kind of said that I do really like acoustic recording, and that is definitely true. My favorite is acoustic upright bass in that sense, although I don't even play it myself.
Right, all right.
But I do mean programming. But there I definitely, basically right now how I would record an acoustic upright bass is have maybe a U47, a U49 I put sometimes on it as a mono mic, but then I use my Royer SF24 as a second mic because it's a stereo ribbon mic.
Yeah, right.
Again, to have stereo. I love to record everything in stereo, really. And so the single mono mic gives me the kind of like snap and punch that I want, and the stereo ribbon gives me, again, spatial information and a very warm, round, nice tone. That takes it easy on the top end, but versus a condenser, which is a bit more aggressive usually in the high end.
Yes, they can get a bit harsh.
Yeah.
Sometimes, yeah. Okay,
while the Royer is just, unfortunately, I don't have an endorsement from Royer, but that microphone, since I have that, is absolutely stunning. The stereo ribbon mic. You put it in front of anything and it sounds amazing. And the particular thing is it sounds natural. I have done even lead vocals with it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you just literally mono sound left and right channel, or did you keep it in stereo?
I keep it in stereo.
So any head movement would come across as almost
I put the people in the cast.
Yeah.
No, you can't dance around too much in front of a stereo mic. That's true.
Yeah.
So you have to have a certain discipline if that's supposed to work.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
But back to bass. So that would be for an acoustic upright bass, and that's a sound that I really appreciate.
Okay. And when we then move on to the next stage of a production, let's talk about mixing and mastering. A lot of people say that mixing the bottom end, the bass end of a song, is one of the hardest things to do. Or we could also say that especially in home setups, it's the most likely thing to go wrong. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, I would say, I would totally agree. It's difficult because of the studio situation per se.
Yeah.
You have nodes in a room. You can literally see that if you play back on your monitors and you move back a meter, the bass sounds different than a meter forward. and 2 meters back, there's standing waves in the room that hopefully you can remedy that with room treatment. And the other very helpful thing I find was through using basically a room calibration software that finds the weaknesses and strengths and resonances in my particular listening position, and then does volume and phase corrections for that position. So gives me at the end, a very, very balanced sound.
Is that something you're using in your studio, or are you recommending that for people at home?
I recommend it for anybody, because these days hardly anybody can or even wants to build a purpose-built studio.
Yes.
First of all, it's very expensive to do that,
it sure is.
especially if you do proper bass treatment.
Yes.
Here in the studio, you see in the top edges of the ceiling and the walls, you see the ubiquitous foam baffles to treat the corner problem with bass. But if I would want to do it properly, I would need another 2 meters at the end of the room, and just have the 2 meters with absorption material just to absorb the bass. That's tuned to the room.
Yeah, and that's obviously very expensive.
It's expensive. It's basically you have to purpose build a room. And who does that these days?
Good. You mentioned standing waves earlier, and that's a phenomenon where a certain frequency gets loud in one spot of the room but quiet in another. So usually there's an up and down for that, which also means that if you move, you mentioned that when you move around, then the tone changes, and that's exactly that. So some frequencies suddenly can get really loud in one spot, or another frequency gets quiet, and so on. So that's one downside of the room correction software, because that can't really compensate for every place in the room, but just for usually the listening position. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, good.
But there's no way around it. I mean, that addresses basically one of the main issues in mixing at all, which is like it's almost impossible to mix sound that it sounds good everywhere.
Yes.
Because these days, well, it's quite simple. People listen either on with headphones, which is probably quite a lot of people do that these days.
Yes.
Or they have it running on, on a stereo in the living room or in their room, whatever, which is usually smaller systems.
Yes.
Or these
cars.
And the really big thing where people listen to music is cars now.
And then also one of the best-selling playback devices is actually mono Bluetooth speakers.
Yes. Yeah,
that's one of the best-selling devices these days. So. There was a time in my life when I told everybody to, ignore mono-compatible mixes, mix stereo, and if, somebody listens in mono, it's their own fault. But I've backpedaled from this quite a lot, because the listening environment has changed so much, and the way people listen. So I no longer do that. I always make sure that it sounds, still okay in mono for that reason.
Well, and that's basically what you mentioned earlier, that even if you move inside a room, even if it's calibrated and so on, it sounds in one normal room in different places different.
Yes.
And that will always be the case. So as an engineer, as a mixing engineer and a mastering engineer, you have to kind of like try to strike a balance that it sounds good on a normal system, that it still sounds good on a small system, on computer speakers, on hell these days even people expect that when they play back music from their phone that it sounds reasonable.
Yes.
Of course, low end bye to a point. But you also don't want to ignore people who have really good systems. You want it to sound good on a really good system as well. So it's a tricky business, really.
Yeah.
And the main requirement for that is that it's not something that comes out of the box. That is something that comes with experience. You as a mixing engineer and mastering engineer, you have to establish a listening environment that you learn how it sounds by listening to a lot of music and listening to reference music, listening to let's say successful music for lack of a better approach, and go like, so does that sound good? If you take somebody, let's say Lady Gaga, big artist, Beyonce, whatever, a lot of money goes into those productions. A lot of top, everything is top. So you can at least expect that what comes back from there hits a certain level of quality, and at the same time, because of the hugeness of the artist, a lot of people have been trained to find that as this is the hip sound right now, and so you can find a scope of different reference music, not only from the present time but also historically, because there was incredibly fantastically mixed music in the 50s and 60s, and especially if you consider the technical limitations of those times.
That's right. Yeah.
An extremely good example is when you see the documentary The Beatles Get Back. You see them sitting in these cluttered studios with dozens of mics open, and they just sit down and play, and then you listen to the recorded version, even the recorded version that they recorded on top of the Apple building, and it sounds amazing. So it can be done.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I just watched the Quincy documentary on Netflix. I warmly recommend that. Quincy Jones, what a legend,
Yeah.
I admire that guy so much. And there were some images of him with Frank Sinatra, and in those days, the Sinatra recordings, I think they're all phenomenal.
Yeah.
They're ridiculously good. And they literally, in many ways, they mixed the orchestra with their feet. So you're a bit too loud. 3 steps back. You're a bit too quiet. 2 steps forward.
Exactly.
That's how they mixed it in recording, basically. Well, other methods as well, but it was actually, great to see. So interesting how some amazing music was made with such minimalistic technology. So what's your take on this? Nowadays, technology is no longer a limiting factor. What people have in home studios is ridiculously fantastic and probably much more capable than what most big studios had 20, 30 years ago. So we have no more or very few technical limitations, and people can just work from home and produce a song for however long they want. So I guess my question is, in your personal experience with the artists that you worked with, does the length of a production correlate to the quality necessarily? Does a long production always mean great results?
No, that's no. I would say no.
Okay.
It depends. There are people. See, for me, the core of music is in the performance.
Yeah.
I'd rather have a kick-ass performance and a crappy sound than the other way around.
Yep, I'm so on board with that. I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
A kick-ass performance recorded badly is still a kick-ass performance and will touch people.
Yes.
While a terrible performance recorded with the most sublime microphones, locations, preamps, whatnot, will always be a crappy performance. So there's always in production there's a point of diminishing returns. Yeah. I'm all for refinement. I'm all for perfectionism as long as you consider perfect to be 80% great and 20% not so great.
Yeah, well said. Because that's a difficult line to draw.
Yes.
You know, where do you say now it's good enough and we need to move on? And I think I brought this up once before, and I actually picked that up from somebody else, but I came across the saying that was around the lines of perfect is the opposite of done. And I found that very, very meaningful. You know, that's because sometimes you just need to finish up and call it a day and move on. So have you got any advice on finding that delicate balance when it's good enough or when it's, you know, important to keep soldering on? And what's your take on that?
That really depends on psychology. It depends on the psychology of the artist. It depends on the psychology of the producer, the engineer, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
You know,
Please explain.
One of the most typical things is that people record and the album is done, and then, you know, like half a year later, man, there's this one spot in that track, it always bugs the shit out of me, you know, that, I can't hear it, I can't stand it, da-da-da-da-da. You know, that happens.
Yeah.
That there's one element or one little thing that looking back you wish you would have done differently, or it's not as you wanted it. That's of course something that you don't really want. You know, you want to avoid that, let's say.
But isn't the question if that's, shouldn't we just look at whether that's just the musician who hears it?
Exactly.
And maybe if nobody else noticed that,
Exactly.
maybe it's actually fine.
That's what I mean. You know, that's the psychology of the artist, which is generally as a disposition too close to the bone. You know, they're too close to their music. That's why you have the role of the producer, is somebody who is committed to the project, but at the same time has a bit of distance and can say like, you know, both ways. Can say like, look, dude, this is not good enough, or say like, come on, man, this is great. You know, don't sweat it. It's working. It has something.
Yeah.
You know, but at the end of the day, it's just opinions. You know, there is no silver bullet to avoid that. You know, you have to wiggle yourself through the process. It depends so much how the personal interaction with the artist is. You know, it might be easy, it might be difficult.
Yeah.
But you have to find that groove. You know, you have to find a place to be sensitive, to be able as a producer or as a sound engineer to communicate to the artist something is not good enough. You have to have the discernment to see if something is good enough, and you have to also have the sensitivity to know when to realize when it's not possible to get something better out of that artist.
Yeah. When you hit the maximum point and
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And you know, just that's it. You know, and roll with it. And to come back where we actually started is, you know, the same with what is good sound. It's something you develop over time, or you develop over time a sense of, when I produce music in my environment with my equipment and I get the sound like this, it sounds good everywhere. You know, and when, I mean, I went through, you know, probably half a dozen different monitoring systems, and it took a long time to settle on what I have now and be really 100% happy with it. And the setup I have now makes it easy for me to get the sound that I want without being in doubt that when I play it back somewhere else it sounds, you know, there are problems, especially in the low end, for instance, you know, and
So you basically know your speaker system and your room like the back of your hand.
Yes.
Yeah, and therefore it makes it very easy for you to identify if there is a problem or if everything's all right as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and in your studio, you do recordings, you do mixing, and you also master here.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's just go through it in reverse order. So, but let's start with mastering first. Do you ever come across music that was clearly mastered at home? Do you hear problems sometimes with released music where you wish that had gone through a more professional mastering process?
Well, that's difficult to say because I don't know if the problem, if I hear problem in that particular kind of music, if the error lies in the recording, in the mix, or if something has been done in the mastering.
Yeah, okay.
That's why my general approach to mastering is that ideally I want to get material from the mixing engineer and the artist where both are completely happy with the sound.
Yeah.
That means ideally I wouldn't have to do anything other than a little bit of formatting, a little bit of volume adjustment, and as transparent compression as possible. Just to get to the industry standard levels that are required for certain media.
Yeah. Be careful with the word required.
Yes, exactly.
The loudness normalization standards, they are shifting. So there is no standard. So whatever we do today, that's how this song will last forever. But standards are changing.
Exactly.
So therefore, we gotta take that with a pinch of salt, I reckon. But
absolutely.
But still, I get your point very clearly.
Yeah. Nevertheless, you cannot ignore them either on too loud side, not on too quiet side, because it makes a difference. In the sound itself, especially if you move towards the loud side, you have to usually apply much more compression, which drastically changes the music.
Yes.
If you, for instance, like in the beginning of my career, I didn't compress anything. I had no compressor. And I managed very well.
Yeah.
I sold a lot of albums and the music sounds good. But of course, as I said before, at the beginning of my career, I was doing New Age music, which is not particularly music that looks for high levels or is particularly impactful also. It's all very smooth and more amorphous than rock music, less rhythm oriented, etc.
Okay.
So the ideal is for a mastering engineer, you get a fantastic mix and you just do small adjustments. Maybe one track compared to another is a little bit lackluster, or the other way around, a bit top heavy, a bit bass heavy, and then you make slight adjustments to bring them together. That's
for consistency.
Yeah, for consistency.
Yeah, cool. Okay. All right. Look, that brings us to the next question now. If a master depends on a really good mix, what's the secret for a really good mix?
Yeah, that is... Well, quite simply, from my perspective, I like it.
Okay.
That's actually, it might sound a little bit simplistic and dumb, but it's not. It's the reality.
Yeah.
Because, for instance, if somebody hires you as a mixing engineer, they don't hire the skill that you can turn a knob. They hire your taste.
That's right. I never release a song or pass a song back to a client unless I love it.
Yeah.
Never ever.
Yes, so exactly.
I love it first, and then I show it to the client.
Yeah, okay. And then the client goes like, "Oh, yeah, that's Jan's sound," or they go, "Oh, that's that's Kamal's. That has a signature almost." And I think that's fair enough, and that's a good thing. There's lots of different tastes around and different ways to do things, and it creates variety and hopefully beauty that touches a lot of people.
That's really well said, because in the end it's not really about my sound. If I was the only person to like my sound and nobody else would, then I wouldn't have a business, you know. So it's in some ways obviously about having a good sense of taste yourself and loving it, but also being compatible with a large enough audience, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you can cut that out if you want, but let me slot in my theory of why or what happens for the artist and why an artist is successful with music.
I'm dying to hear it. Go for it. We're not cutting it out. We're not cutting it out.
So my feeling is, and because I'm actually coming to the business, so to speak, from the musician side. I was a musician first, or I am a musician first, and then an engineer, and so on and so forth, and a producer. So what's in my own experience, and by now, you know, I'm looking back at, you know, almost 50 years of being related to music, at least, you know, and playing instruments, is when I make music or when I write music, when I write a piece, what I'm doing is, and that's my personal experience, I put it out, hey, check it out if that is something in your own experience. So in my experience, I'm balancing myself out. You know, I'm basically expressing something that needs to be balanced. You know, something is in tension within me. And I bring it out in music, which by working with rhythm, with harmonies, with melodies, kind of like it's a constant massaging of tension and relaxation, let's say. You know,
wow.
It's constantly moving, it's dynamic.
Yeah.
You know, it draws my interest and lets go of my interest. You know, and before I get bored, it draws interest again. And so what I'm doing is, you could say, in a way, I'm kind of like balancing my psychology, my emotional, psychological state with making music. And for me, it's very clear. You see that historically, but also if you look at different age groups, what they listen to. If you take, for instance, teenagers, they listen to, very often, there's a lot of aggressive music.
Yeah, high energy stuff. Yeah.
High energy stuff, you know, that kicks ass, and, you know, that kind of like rattles the storm of hormones they experience. And by tuning into that, you know, by expressing themselves, even if they don't make music themselves, but they hear music where somebody, let's say, has the same inner tensions and conflicts and fears and worries and ambitions and hopes, you know, that is expressed in that music, and suddenly somebody hears it and goes like, that's how I feel. You know, it can be in a hook line, it can be in lyrics, you know, often short snippets of lyrics kind of like catapult a piece of music because so many people can relate to it.
Wow, yes.
You know?
It makes so much sense, yes.
So here we have somebody who expresses that, and then you have the receiving end. So if you have a lot of people who have, let's say, the same affliction or condition as the musician, potentially you can get very successful. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. That's gold, Kamal. That's gold. I love it. Yeah.
And what
that
also
so
is quite obvious is with advancing age, you know, people, you often, it's a bit of a cliche, older people like to listen to classical music or so, you know, because it doesn't, as an aging person, that need for experience and extreme experience is waning. You know, you don't need that much fuss anymore in your life. You know, you're quite happy to, you know, to relax. You know, things get more relaxed, generally speaking. So the music taste changes. Yeah. You know, and what is balanced or what is expressed in classical music, you know, or new age music, or basically music that's not as edgy, that is not that, doesn't have that much tension, suits that particular psychology, and that is not necessarily tied to an age, but there's lots of people who love classical music who are young, or middle-aged, or whatever, But that's why I think the overriding thing is what's going on in your psychology at the moment, what music you like.
That explains so much. That basically explains the music that I listen to throughout my life.
Yeah.
I really like that. Yeah.
It's the soundtrack of your life. What you
it
like.
Sure is. Yeah. Well, I'm definitely getting older, but I still love my Slayer.
There you go.
Grew up with that.
But that's for me. It's also the beauty is it takes the judgment out of me. I don't have to. And literally, that's how I feel. I don't have to dismiss music. Oh, this is terrible music. It's just I don't like it. Okay.
Yeah.
But I know that somebody, at least the guy who's playing this, or the group, or the people who are playing it, for them it expresses something that's important for them, that balances them, that heals them, that is pleasant for them.
Yes.
So great.
Wow.
Good for them.
Wow. Okay.
And it makes it also possible because as a mixing engineer and mastering engineer, I come across a whole variety of different genres. I can dedicate myself to a good sound without having to completely love the music per se.
Yeah. I see. Wow. Okay, that's a lot to take in there right now. Well, thank you for sharing, Kamal. That's really good. I'm just trying to steer back to my train of thought. We were talking about, a good sounding mix, what makes a good sounding mix, and your sense of taste. And now you explained how your sense of taste interacts with music, and that's phenomenal. Because in some ways it also explains why certain songs are written that way. So it goes back literally to the songwriting and also, I guess, the arrangement in some ways. I find that, the arrangement of a song is probably the most powerful mix tool one has.
Yeah.
So if the arrangement is overloaded or too minimal or not suitable, a mix will never really work. Can you relate to that? Would you agree?
Well, definitely arrangement, instrumentation, structuring of a song is, that's way, that's a much earlier and much more important element of the music than the mix per se and the mastering. Basically there's a certain, the subtleties get finer and finer, towards mastering, you could say.
Oh yeah.
First you sit down on the piano with your guitar and da 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 da, 6 chords, A, B, B, A, Bob's your uncle. But what do you do with that, Do you have A, B, a short C, B, A, or da da? You can do so many things.
Yes.
So definitely arrangement, instrumentation makes a huge difference. An interesting part of that is, when you have like well-known artists, they bring out a song and it becomes a huge hit. And then they go and sit down and play it unplugged.
Yeah.
Sting sits down with his little mini guitar and he still pulls it off. Yeah. Without arrangement, well, no, not without arrangement, but without production value. He just sits there with his guitar and it kind of like knocks you off your feet or not.
So that's a song that sort of translates. It's a strong song, no matter whether it's a full band behind him or just himself and a guitar.
Yes, so that's
a sign that
if you can do that,
song.
that's strong songwriting. Yeah. But a big part is also, the artist who plays it. Even if he plays it, just what the artist is able to bring across with emotionally with the tone of voice, the phrasing, and the way how he plays the instrument or she plays the instrument. there are so many cover versions of hit songs, and they're all like, oh, beautifully done and so on and so forth. I did it myself, as you mentioned before, my foray into singing by doing cover versions of Peter Gabriel and Sting songs. So the question then is, do I diminish the original song or do I make it my own? So is this song beautiful because it's a Sting song, or is it still beautiful even if I sing it, who can't sing like Sting, don't have his voice? Can I bring something across that contains the beauty of the songwriting of Sting, but it's not just karaoke? There's Kamal in it.
Yeah. Okay. That's really deep. So just trying to wrap my head around all of this. So I remember listening to these songs. That was a while ago, and of course I recognized the melodies, but the coin didn't even drop till later who I was actually listening to, or who the songwriter was. To me, it was you telling a story musically and giving it your own musical phrasing, and you told a story there that to me sounded like it was very dear to your heart.
Absolutely, yes.
And that definitely came across, and that's what kept me listening. And not once did I think about how that measured up against Peter Gabriel at no time.
Yeah.
It was just your own version of these songs, and they definitely had a very unique spin, a very personal take, and so that's.
I succeeded in
yes,
straight.
definitely. It was, look, had a couple of goosebumps moments as I was listening to these songs. Did you ever publish those officially? Or were they just like a hobby project more for yourself?
Well, it's definitely a hobby project, but I have to admit that's the daunting thing is with publishing a cover song in that fashion is to basically get the permissions and so on and so forth. Basically, it's a bit of a song and a dance to do that, to get that onto YouTube also, and it's actually also, it costs. If I release a song from...
Let me just shamelessly plug another episode here, but we just had Nikki from APRA on the podcast, and she had a lot of interesting things to say about it. We also spoke about releasing cover versions, and my impression was it was maybe not quite as complex. But anyway, look, maybe just...
yeah, that's all right.
Okay.
Maybe I give her a call and ask her about it.
She can definitely help you with that. But it would be nice to actually have these songs, publicly available at some stage, because they were absolutely lovely. Thank you. Good. Kamal, you've met so many musicians in your life, and I would assume that there were some amazing professional musicians among, but probably also a lot of hobbyists, maybe some beginners. Did you ever come across, did you notice any similarities between the beginners who actually go through all the stages and become as successfully eventually, or the people who give up and never get anywhere? Is there anything but the musical talent? Are there any character traits, any demeanors that successful musicians have, in your opinion?
Well, yes, of course. There's personality traits.
Explain.
One is I would say is tenacity. Generally, I would say I believe, and I emphasize I believe, that anything that you feel passionate about and you stick with will very, very, very likely lead to success. And with success, I not necessarily mean that it becomes, like a business success, but a success that that person, that it brings you deep satisfaction and fulfillment.
Wow.
Because I know amazing musicians who don't have it's the classic, the starving musician is an archetype.
Yeah.
And I know musicians who are very inexperienced and who lack a certain level of craft, let it be their voice or their instrument, who are hugely successful.
Yeah.
And that is, let's say, unpleasant to watch from the outside, because I wish for the person that I deem to have great talent and skill and I wish them success. I've produced several albums that I find absolutely fantastic, and I think they are worth be heard by everybody, and are on par in terms of artistic expression and execution, meaning production and sound, that can be up there with the best of them. And yet, nobody has heard of them.
Okay. Could that be the lack of, let's say, marketing and distribution skills?
Yes, that's part of it. Particularly now, because these days, the whole industry is still in such a flux and change that even the concept of an album is basically out of the window. All the people who stand behind a final product, a song that you can hear on Spotify or YouTube, are basically don't exist anymore in the consciousness of the consumer. You can be lucky that somebody who plays your song that he likes, if he remembers the artist, he might only remember the song title and have no idea who the artist is, let alone no idea who the producer, who the engineer, who the musicians are, all the people that were usually on the back of a vinyl album, or at least in the booklet of a CD. And then there's the other aspect is also that you say something particularly with one song, but usually as a musician, you have more than one song. You have phases where you write, phases of your life where you have a particular style or expression, and you put them together on an album, and there's a story not only within one piece, but in the succession of the pieces. There's an arc of storytelling, or there's an arc of drama. You start with something upbeat, and then the next piece you put something that's even more upbeat, and the third piece is even more bombastic, and then you drop it and fall into something smooth and soft, or only to jump into something very rhythmical or so. You can create
a journey.
A whole journey, exactly. Where each piece is a small journey in itself. And that is unfortunately getting a bit lost. Plus the deserved acknowledgement for all the talents that make it possible in the end to listen to that music.
That's some deep thought here, but I could definitely relate to that. I'm one of the few dinosaurs left who still listen to albums start to finish, if ever, But there's definitely a lot to be said there. Say, Kamal, if somebody is interested and wants to find out more about you, where could they go? Have you got a website or social media? Where could somebody find you?
The usual website, artofaudio.com.au. And Art of Audio, one word.
No spaces.
No spaces. Artofaudio.com.
Is that the website?
Sorry.
We should probably clarify this, make sure that we get it right. So it's artofaudio.com.au?
Yes, that's it.
Fantastic.
And I'm also on under the same name on Facebook.
On Facebook as well. Excellent. Good. So if anybody needs any help, they can reach out to you, or just maybe want to have a chat with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Good.
Thank you. I would also like to invite everybody to maybe join our Production Talk podcast community group on Facebook if you want to reach out to me. I answer questions there. And if you want to listen to all the other episodes as well, there are a couple that we touched on today. So I'd like to point out episode 10 and episode 17. We had a couple of, similar points here. And then, of course, we also spoke to Talia and from 301 Mastering, who had a lot of amazing things to say. And, so Kamal, thank you so much for being with me today and our listeners and sharing all your amazing wisdom. I really appreciate that, my friend. Thank you, Kamal.
Well, thank you for having me. Hang on 1 second.
Please.
I think it would be nice to give a little blurb about the binaural.
Oh, of course.
We didn't do that.
Yes. We just mentioned right at the beginning that we are playing back binaurally today. But
Yes.
come on, please explain what's going on there.
So usually, you have people sitting in front. Each one has a mic in front of them. So today we recorded this just because it happened. I have a remnant from the 70s, which is a dummy head. And a dummy head is literally how it sounds. It's like the head from a mannequin, but just the head. And it has some quite real shaped silicon ears on it. And there, inside the mannequin's skull, sits actually a mic. So there are two mics inserted into that dummy head. And it creates, when you wear headphones, and that's important to remember, you have to wear headphones, a very natural perception, because
It's very realistic.
yes, because although we only have two ears, we are able to perceive more than two directions. We don't only have the left and right, we have the front, the back, the bottom, the top. So it's a very rich experience.
That's
And
amazing.
also, for instance, when I'm moving around here, now I'm on the right side of the dummy head.
That was my side. Yeah.
That was your side.
Sure.
But also, for instance, if I can do... Oh, there you go. The noise in the room. And if I drop something, that sounds
Realistic.
and stereophony like this is wonderful.
Amazing stuff, Kamal. Thank you.
A bit more battery.